Hey guys, Henning from FlippedNormals here, and in today's tutorial we will take a look at our top tips for switching to Blender. This is really useful if you come from another software and you are now looking to switch to Blender. Now before we get started with that, I just want to let you guys know that we just released our full course for switching to Blender. This is a 10-hour course where we cover really everything you need to know in order to switch to Blender, where we go through all the features and we will really take you through step by step the different features you need to know, where we assume that you already know 3D and you simply want to translate your skills. We're not holding your hand when it comes to explaining what an extrusion and an HDRI is. We're simply getting straight to the point, and by the end of it you will really know how Blender works and you can start using this for your personal or your professional work. So with that said, tip number 1 is to embrace Blender when you're starting with Blender. When you come from another software like Max or Maya, it's incredibly tempting to try to recreate your old workflow in this new tool. This is what I did, and this is what most people seem to do. Stop doing that right away and just embrace Blender for Blender. It's going to be frustrating, it's going to take some time, but by the end of it, you will really have a workflow that works with Blender instead of working against Blender. This, for instance, means that you should not start to change your hotkeys to whatever hotkeys you used to have in your old 3D software. And you should absolutely not use the industry-compatible hotkeys for navigation and general working with Blender. You need to stick to the defaults. If you were to use the industry-compatible set, it means that you can't follow a single tutorial online at all. The reason for this is that Blender is extremely hotkey based, and if you can't use the hotkeys they're using in tutorials, it's just going to be impossible to actually do anything. So make sure you embrace Blender the way Blender is, and then you can start to set up your hotkeys and change it around once you're comfortable with this. There are a lot of areas where Blender is absolutely fantastic. It can do things you can't do in normal 3D software. For instance, right now we have a fairly standard looking viewport, but if we were to hit the Z key now, and then we were to go into the render view, then you can see that we now have a fully rendered scene, which is properly ray traced. We're not using kind of tricks here to optimize this. This is the final rendered image, which is absolutely fantastic. But it's not just an interactive render view, which you might have in some other software, where you can see the render, but you can't interact with it. This is a live scene. So we can zoom in here now, and we can change the model here. We can add new loops to it, and then you can see that this updates in real time. If you want to change the materials for this guy here, if let's say we want to change this from metallic to non-metallic, we can easily do that. Whatever we want to do, we can change this so quickly on the fly. And this is really something you just have to get used to. Tip number 2, Blender is incredibly gesture-based and immediate. Let me show you what I mean. If you were to hit Shift and A right now, we will be able to create a new mesh. Already here, it's fast to create new objects. Then we can create a cube. And with this cube, we can now just start to do some simple modeling and we can move it around. You don't really have to select a manipulator. In some software, you have to select a tool, then you have to move it like so. In Blender, you can simply hit the G key to move it around. You can hit the S key to scale it, and you can hit the R key to rotate this around like so. This is incredibly immediate, and it means that you don't have to first select a tool and then click on the manipulators. You simply hit the S key, and then the moment you hit the S key, you are now scaling this up and down. If you want to start modeling, you can hit the Tab key to go into edit mode. You can select an edge, hit Ctrl B, and now you can start to bevel. Scroll up and down to change the segments. You can select a polygon like so. You can now just extrude it, and we can now hit Ctrl and B and we can bevel this. If you want to scale this down again now, you hit the S key and you can just scale this down like so. If you want to reset the coordinates of the object, move this back to the center, we can hit Alt G, we can hit Alt R, and we can hit Alt and S. And now this will just reset the scale, rotation, and the translation. It means we can now go in here and we can just keep on modeling. We can select an edge, we can hit Ctrl B to bevel, and you can just see that it's incredibly immediate. If you want to move this on a specific axis, we can also do that. We can hit the G key, then we can hit the middle mouse button, and now we can constrain it to a specific axis. So now we can just move it here, we can hit middle mouse button and move it here, and so on. So it's very intuitive once you get used to this. Now, I recommend you find specific tutorials for exactly how to do all of these commands. This is not a tutorial for specifically getting into this. The point we're making now is that you can do stuff incredibly quickly, and you can very easily start to model, and you can change stuff around in your scene. So spend some time to get familiar with this approach. Do not start by using these tools up here, the general manipulators, because this is going to slow you down significantly. It's going to be uncomfortable in the beginning because it's a completely new way of working, but get comfortable with how gesture-based it is. Something you are going to experience though is that you're going to be panicking a little bit because you're going to be accidentally doing stuff all the time. You're going to be hitting the S key and now you're like, oh man, I'm just scaling my object. And then you try to scale it back, or you hit the left mouse button and now you have to try to scale it back. What you can do is you can hit the right mouse button and this will cancel any command you're currently doing. So if you scale this to oblivion and back, you simply hit the right mouse button and this brings you back to where you were. If you were to move it, right mouse button, move it back like so. Notable exception to this. This is when you are extruding something out and you were to extrude it now and you hit the right mouse button, you're like, cool, now I cancel my extrusion, but you didn't. You cancel the moving of the extruded polygons. So right now, if we were to scale this polygon down, what you would expect to happen would be that this entire top section would be scaled down. But what we're seeing instead is that we are now scaling down simply this polygon, which we extruded. If you aren't aware of what's going on, this is going to be extremely painful because now you're going to have double geometry all the time. There's no way to really tell that you have double geometry, particularly if you have a dense mesh. So be aware of that. Right mouse button cancels your command, but particularly with some modeling commands like extrusion, it cancels only the translation of the extrusion, not the extrusion itself. Something to note as well is whenever you're using a tool like this, if you look all the way on the bottom here, you can see that you have all these little tips. You can see if we hit G, you can move. If you hit R, you can rotate. S to resize. If you hit Control, you can like snap it. There are just a lot of different things you can do with each tool, and since it is extremely hotkey based, you are not going to remember them right away. This will become second nature, but it's going to take some time, and until this becomes comfortable, make sure to look on the bottom of the screen and you will get the help you need. Tip number 3 is to think non-destructively when working in Blender. Due to the very powerful modifier system, we can make some pretty impressive geometry with very little geo. In this case here, our little model is made from 1 cube and 2 single polygons. And I'll explain how this works. Again, not a tutorial on using the modifiers, more on how to approach it, how to think about modeling in Blender. So we are going to be just hiding everything but the roof tiles, and then we're going to be disabling the different modifiers, and then we'll take this one step at a time. So what we have is a starting point is a single polygon. Then we're adding a solidify modifier on top. Then we are adding a bevel. Then we are using an array, another array, and finally another array. And this means that now if we were to change anything on the original polygon, we can change it on every single one of these. Really, really useful if we need to do some kind of procedural modeling like this. Then we have the second shape, which is fairly similar in its approach. We have a single polygon like this, and then we are adding a solidify modifier to it. We are adding an array just to move it over here. And then we're adding a bevel. And with the bevel, we also have a bit of a profile as well. So we can change this right here. What's cool about this is we can change anything about this as well. So now if we were to just enable these in edit mode, like so, then we can go in and we could start to change the proportions of this guy. If I just were to select this vertex, we can change the proportion. We can change the shape of it. We can add a loop in the middle. So we can do all sorts of cool stuff with procedural modeling like this. And then for the last one, we have a cube, and we have just added a bevel to this as well. So very quickly, you can add some pretty complicated geometry, which you can control in a very easy fashion. Now, speaking of non-destructive modeling, the Boolean system in Blender is also pretty powerful. In this case, we have a simple cube where we have used a torus and a cylinder to cut it out. So if we were to just hide these two, you can see the end result. Now, this is nothing too crazy, but it means that we can now go into, for instance, cylinder, and we can scale this down. We can move it up we can just move it around, and in general, you can just change the result quite drastically. This is not advisable if you need really clean and workable topology, but if you're doing anything which doesn't require clean topology, the Boolean modifier is absolutely fantastic. So non-destructive modeling is incredibly powerful in Blender. Tip number 4, understanding the 3D cursor and the origin point. You have no doubt experienced the 3D cursor, and this is this little guy which is floating around in space. The reason you have experienced this is most likely because you have done this. You have used the right mouse button and you have held down the shift key and you have now moved this guy around. And what you're seeing now is when you're doing this, you're getting some weird behaviors in your scene. The first one is that if we were to add a mesh, this will be added at the point of the 3D cursor, which is really cool. Pretty annoying if you don't know about it. The way I like to think about the 3D cursor is as a temporary pivot point. So for instance, if we were now to make a mesh and we can just move it over here so it's not in the exact same spot, we can now use this as a pivot point if we were to hit the period key. Now you can see here we have active element, which is by default, and we can set this to 3D cursor. So now it's going to scale down to wherever the 3D cursor is. If we were to move the 3D cursor around with shift right mouse button, and we were to scale it now, you can now see this scales down to where the 3D cursor is. We can also go into edit mode by the tab key. Then we can select one of these points, one of the verts. Then we can bring up the pie menu, which is shift and S. And now we can set this to, for instance, be cursor to active. And now the 3D cursor has been set to this specific point. So now if we want to scale this down, this will now be scaled down to this exact point. If you want to reset it, instead of having to go in here and kind of trying to get back to the center, you can hit shift and S, and then we can do cursor to world origin, and that just puts it right back in the center. So don't be annoyed by the 3D cursor. Learn to use the 3D cursor. Embrace this. And speaking of the 3D cursor, we have something which is somehow related, and that is the origin point. If you were to look at this cube now, you can see it has this little orange center to it. This is the origin point of the object, and you can think of this more as the center of the object. This is important for a bunch of different reasons. If we were now to make a plane, and we go to add modifier, and then we will make a screw modifier, and then we set the screw amount to be a little higher, what you can see now is that this will be using the origin point as the center. Now, if we were to move the origin point around, the modifier would act in a completely different way. The way we can move the origin point around is by hitting the control and the period key. Now you can see that we have this little gizmo, and now we can hit the G key and we can move this around to where we want it to be. So you can see that the modifier is entirely based on where the origin point actually is. So hit control and period again to remove the ability to set the origin point. Now there are a few ways we can actually control the origin point as well. We can go to object, then we can set origin, and here is probably the feature you'll be using the most here, called origin to geometry. If you set that, it's going to go right in the center of the actual object. You can also see here we have set a little hotkey for this, which is Alt and C. So if we were to hit Alt and C, just undo this, then we can see that this pops right back into it. It's really easy for the origin point to be moved around by accident. For instance, if you were to make a cube like this, we go into edit mode, then we move the cube like so. Now you can see the origin point is in the wrong spot. You can see the origin point is right there. And in this case, you would then just have to hit Alt and C, or you go into object, set origin, and then we can set origin to geometry. If you want to set a custom hotkey for this, you simply right mouse button on it, then you set change hotkey, and then you just type in the key you want, and then you just accept this. If you don't want to set a key, you can also use a feature called quick favorites. This is really handy. Now, for instance, if you want to use set origin, and we can set origin to geometry, you can right mouse button on it and hit add to quick favorites. And now if we hit the Q key, you can see that we have origin to geometry. So now we can simply select the object, origin to favorites, and then you can see it's now in the middle. Quick favorites is a fantastic feature, and I use this when I have to use a feature for a fair bit, but only within a restricted time period. Let's say I'm doing a lot of resetting of the origin point, but only for the next 10 minutes because I have a lot of objects. Then I'll be using quick favorites. If this is something I use all the time, then I'll simply put this on a hotkey. If you're using the origin point a lot as well, I recommend enabling the 3D viewport pie menu. You can do this by going to Edit, Preferences, then we go into the Blender Preferences, Add-ons, hit the pie, or type pie rather, and then enable this menu. And then we will go down to Origin Pie, and here you can see Control, Alt, and X. And if we were to select this object now, Control, Alt, and X, you can see we have the same menu as before. I use this a fair bit, where I will go and say Origin to Cursor, or Origin to Center of Mass, or Geometry to Origin, which for instance means if you want to move the geometry to the origin point, Control, Alt, X, and then Geometry to Origin, and it moves it to where the origin point is. So understanding the origin point and the 3D cursor is really important when dealing with Blender. Tip number 5, lock camera to view. If you have worked a little bit in Blender so far, you've probably found the camera view. You can access this by hitting the 0 key on the numpad, or by holding down the tilde key and then view camera. And now you're in the camera view. The problem right now is if you were trying to navigate, you would be taken out of the camera view. And this is absolutely infuriating, because now how are you actually supposed to move the camera around? The fix for this is easy. If we hit the N key to bring up the side panel here, and we go to View Lock, and here we have a button called Lock and Camera to View. If we were to enable this now, you can now see that we can navigate around using the default Blender navigation, and all your camera problems have been solved. This is something I use a fair bit, so I will set this to my quick favorites. So just right mouse button on it, add to quick favorites, and then I can enable and disable this. The reason this is handy to disable as well is if we want to zoom into the actual frame right now, you see we're just navigating in the viewport. If we hit the Q key and then lock camera to view, now we can actually zoom into the frame. So it's not that this is necessarily better behavior being enabled, it's just a different behavior. So this will save you a lot of tears, and this was really a point of frustration for me when I first started with Blender. Tip number 6, understanding the properties tabs. So if you go here to the right, you can see that we have a bunch of different tabs, and these can be quite confusing. I don't find the icons to be particularly helpful, and when you're starting out, it's pretty confusing to where you're going to be finding different things. So we will just have a quick look through a few of them. First little tip within this little tip is you can hold on a control key and then middle mouse button, and now you can scroll through them. So if you quickly want to just go from one to the other, you can just hold control and middle mouse button. The first we are going to be covering is going to be the render properties all on top. This is where you generally change your render settings, like which engines are you using? Are you using the GPU or the CPU? How many samples do you have? And general render settings. Then the second icon here is the outputs properties. This is where we would change anything regarding the render output when it comes to what is the resolution, what is the frame range, and where does it go to, and what file format is it. Next up, we have the view layer. This is where we will be rendering out a render process. So if you need render process, this is where you will be enabling your render process or AOVs. So for instance, right here, we have a cryptomat. So if you want that, you simply enable the cryptomat. Then we have the scene properties. And really the only thing I keep using this scene properties tabs for is to change the camera. If you have multiple cameras, this is where you will be changing the active camera. Then we're going to be covering the object properties. This is the icon with the yellow squares. This is where we have object properties such as the translation, the rotation, and scaling. We also have things like general visibility for the object, which is quite handy. I usually use this menu for the transformation and rotation and the scaling right here. Then we have the modifiers. The modifiers is a tab you're going to be using a lot, and here you can find all your different modifiers. The way it works is you have 4 different columns. We have the modify, where you modify the data in the model. Generate, which will actually generate new data, which will generate new topology, where you have mirroring, array, deforming, where you're only deforming it. And then we have physics as well as a separate tab. Then we're going to be skipping the next 3 ones. They are relating to physics and particles and constraints, and that's not really something I use a whole lot. So we're going to be jumping straight into the object data properties. This is a tab you don't necessarily need a whole lot, but once you do need it, it's very useful. This is where you have some like vertex groups, shape keys. Shape keys are also just known as blend shapes or morph targets in other software. It's where we have our UV maps, and we just have more data regarding our object. Next up, we have the Material tab, and this is where we can modify and add and remove materials from our objects. And the reason we're not covering all of these is because you really aren't going to be spending the vast majority of time in all of these. I usually spend my time in the render properties, under the object properties, and then the modifiers, and then in the object data properties as well. This will also change based on what we have selected. If we were to select a camera, for instance, you can see this changes entirely. So now we have a camera icon right here, but it's still green, which means it's the object data properties for that. If we change it to a light, you can now see that this now has a light enabled. So if you can't add a modifier to something, in this case, we can add a modifier to a polygon, but we can't add it to an area light. There's no point in having the modifier icon right here. So this is context sensitive. Something you are going to be doing a lot as well when you are a beginner is you're going to mess up the interface a fair bit. And the way you do actually mess up the interface, or you customize it, is by going up into any one of the panels, and in the top right corner, you're going to be dragging it out like so. And this is going to be happening a fair bit. And you're going to be reaching a point where you have just messed up the interface beyond recognition. It can look something like this. And there are a few ways of fixing this. The first one is to actually just undo what you just did. So if we were to go and actually move these back to where they were, we can start to collapse them or join them back. So if you find the line in between the two panels, you can see this is where you can actually move it. You can now right mouse button on it, and then you can select join areas. And now you get this little arrow and saying which one do you want to join to which. And in this case, we just join them together. Right mouse button, join areas, right mouse button, and then join areas. And then we can do the same thing here as well. Right mouse button and then join areas. And now we are back to where we were. But let's say that you have completely messed it up. You have clicked here and you've made this a texture node. You have gone up here and you have just destroyed this beyond all belief. What you can do is you can save your scene. Then you can go to File, New, and just select General. And just make sure your scene is saved. And then we hit Don't Save. And then we have a new clean interface. By default, Blender is going to load the interface of the scene. It actually saves the interface into the blend file. But what we can do, we can go to File, Open, and now we can select our scene. Then we can go up here to the top right. And you see this little cog icon? Click on this one and disable Load UI. And this is going to load in the file, but is not going to load the interface. So now you can see that we have the same scene as we had before, just without any of the nasty interfaces from the last scene. The next step is to seriously look into what add-ons are available for Blender. Add-ons is just Blender's way of saying plugin. There are so many useful add-ons which can really speed up your work so much. Some of the tools in Blender are pretty lackluster. For instance, the UV tools are not fantastic. The Retopo tools needs a little bit of spice up. And this is where you can find add-ons to improve certain areas of your workflow. So I recommend if you are a production artist in Blender and you want to get your work done as fast as possible, look into all the available add-ons and figure out the ones which are good for you. Now, slight caveat here is that you don't want to do this right in the beginning, because you need to first just embrace Blender for what it is and figure out how you can squeeze out as much juice out of vanilla Blender before you start getting into add-ons. The problem with getting into add-ons would be that if you were to be highly reliant on 20 different add-ons and Blender updates, all these add-ons are not going to be updated at the same time, which means you might be a few versions behind. In some cases, you might be years behind actually updating. And now you are running 2 different versions of Blender just to have your add-ons. So be aware of that. Personally, I'm not really using a whole lot of add-ons, because if I were to do that, nobody could follow the tutorials because it would be such a customized version of Blender. But I do really recommend checking out some of the add-ons. The first add-on we will have a look at is Machine Tools. This is a fantastic add-on which adds a lot of power to a bunch of different areas to Blender. It's particularly great for hard surface modeling, where you can see there are a bunch of really smart features here. But it's also much more than that. It really overhauls Blender to the point that it's not really recognizable. So if you want to become a power user of Blender, I highly recommend checking out Machine Tools. Then we have Decal Machine. Decal Machine is brilliant if you are dealing with anything regarding decals. Essentially, if you are a game artist and you do a lot of texturing with decals, you really need to get Decal Machine. I know a lot of people who's been moving over to Blender in order to simply get access to Decal Machine. Next up, we have Hardops and Box Cutter. This is a bundle which contains some absolutely brilliant tool when it comes to hard surface modeling. If you are doing a lot of hard surface modeling, I cannot recommend this bundle enough. It will completely change the way you are working when it comes to hard surface modeling. And speaking of add-ons, if you have any cool tips for add-ons yourself, which you use a lot, just feel free to leave a comment below just to let people know which ones they should check out. The next tip is regarding groups. If you come from Maya, you will most likely be missing groups. And while I said you shouldn't try to recreate Maya inside of Blender, groups can be quite handy, particularly if you're working with Maya and Blender. And this is where I do recommend getting the machine tool add-on we just talked about in the last tip. So if we were now to install this add-on, you can easily do this simply by going to add-ons and install, and then just install the zip file. Then we go all the way down here, and here you can see we have group. Now, if you want to group your items now, we can simply just duplicate these two guys. Then we can hit Control and G, and now you have grouped these two. Essentially what it's doing is it simply makes an empty, or what you might know as a null or locator, and it simply just parents these two under it. Now it means that you can actually move these two around in a fairly easy to use manner. So grouping used in a machine tool add-on will really help you group something fast. Tip number 10, setting up HDRIs. Setting up HDRIs was something I really struggled when I first got started with Blender, and it's quite simple once you know how. We will go to the shading tab, and then we will go from object to world, and now you can see that we have a different interface right here. We're no longer changing the objects, we are now changing the world. This is also the tab right here as well. Now, what we can do is we can go and enable the node wrangler. The node wrangler is really handy because this, first off, it just speeds up everything to do with nodes, but very specifically for setting up HDRIs. So go to your add-ons, enable the node wrangler, and then select the background node, and then we hit Control and T. And now we can very easily just input an HDRI right here. So just double click on it, and now you can see we have an HDRI. Now, what you can see here is I'm actually using the material preview, which is using a pre-built-in HDRI, and that's not what we're looking for. We need to go to render view, and there you go. You can now see that we have an HDRI loaded in now, and we can spin this around if you go to rotation and then Z. Remember that in Blender, Z is up. Now keep in mind this has to be an environmental texture node. If you were to just use a regular texture node for this, this wouldn't work. You really need to use an environmental texture node for your HDRIs. Now for two little bonus tips. Tip number 11, setting up materials. This is also deceptively tricky and it took me a little bit of time to figure out how to do this. So the way we set up a material is we first click on the object we want. Then we click on the material tab down here. And this already has some materials. I'll just remove that by removing the slot. Then I'll hit new. And then we have a material. And we can rename this by double clicking on it. And we can call this red. Then we can change the material properties down here. And we can make this red. The reason you're not seeing anything right now is because you are currently in the solid viewport mode. So if you hit the Z key, you can now change this to solid or to change it to any one of the other ones. If you want to see your material, you have to go to rendered, or you have to go to material preview, like so. Now, if you want to copy this material onto these two, first we select these two objects, then we shift click and we select the last one. And then we click on the little triangle here and we hit copy material to select it. We can also hit Control and L, which will make links, and now we can hit material. Now, the copy wording here isn't actually correct because it doesn't actually copy it. It instances it across. So now if we were to change the material here, you can see that this changes for all of them. So just be aware that while it says copy, it doesn't actually copy it around. You can also go in here as well and you can change the material to something else. Here you can see when we removed it before, it didn't actually remove it. The only thing it did, it just removed it from the view. So if you want to use a material which has already been created, we just go in here and we can just change the material to whatever we want to. Tip number 12, and the last one, selecting backfaces. If we go into edit mode right now and we just drag around like so, this only selects what you can actually see. So if you want to select what's on the back here, we have to hit Shift and Z. And now you can see through the object and then we can select them. There is no way to really select this without going through this like so. So Shift and Z, and that will allow you to select through. So those are all the tips we had for you for switching to Blender. I really hope this here has been useful. And remember that we just launched our full 10-hour switching to Blender for experienced artists if you and your team would be interested in actually switching to Blender. So thank you so much for watching, and if you like this video, make sure to leave a comment, like, and subscribe, and hit the little notification bell if you want to be updated every single time we put out a new video.